o'clock. It appeared incredible to him that only a mile or two away people were sitting in theatres applauding farces, and that at Cannon Street Station, a few yards off, other people were calmly taking the train to various highly respectable suburbs whose names he was gradually learning. He had the uplifting sensation of being in another world, which comes to us sometimes amid surroundings violently different from our usual surroundings. The most ordinary noises, of men calling, of a chain running through a slot, of a distant siren, translated themselves to his ears into terrible and haunting sounds, full of portentous significance. He looked over the side of the boat into the brown water, and asked himself what frightful secrets lay hidden in its depth. Then he put his hand into his hip pocket and touched the stock of his Colt revolver. That familiar substance comforted him. The oarsman had instructions to drop slowly down to the pool, as the wide reach below the tower is called. These two men had not been previously informed of the precise object of the expedition, but now that they were safely afloat, Hazel judged it expedient to give them some notion of it. "We expect to come across a rather suspicious steam launch," he said. "My friend here is very anxious to get a sight of her, and until he has seen her nothing definite can be done." "What sort of craft is she, sir?" asked the stroke oar, a fat-faced man who seemed absolutely incapable of any serious exertion. "I don't know," Racksole replied, "but as near as I can judge she is about 60 feet in length and painted black. I fancy I shall recognize her when I see her." "Not much to go by, that," exclaimed the other man curtly, but he said no more. He, as well as his mate, had received from Theodore Racksole 1 English sovereign as a kind of preliminary fee, and an English sovereign will do a lot towards silencing the natural sarcastic tendencies and free speech of a Thames waterman. "There's one thing I noticed," said Racksole suddenly, "and I forgot to tell you of it, Mr. Hazel. Her screw seemed to move with a rather irregular, lame sort of beat." Both watermen burst into a laugh. "Oh," said the fat rower, "I know what you're after, sir. It's Jack Everett's launch, commonly called Squirm. She's got a 4-bladed propeller, and one blade is broken off short." "Aye, that's it, sure enough," agreed the man in the bows. "And if it's her you want, I seed her lying up against Cherry Gardens Pier this very morning." "Let us go to Cherry Gardens Pier, by all means, as soon as possible," Racksole said, and the boat swung across stream and then began to creep down by the right bank, feeling its way past wharves, many of which, even at that hour, were still busy with their cranes, that descended empty into the bellies of ships and came up full. As the two watermen gingerly manoeuvred the boat on the ebbing tide, Hazel explained to the millionaire that the Squirm was one of the most notorious craft on the river. It appeared that when anyone had a nefarious or underhand scheme afoot which necessitated river work, Everett's launch was always available for a suitable monetary consideration. The Squirm had got itself into 1,000 scrapes, and out of those scrapes again with safety, if not precisely with honour. The river police kept a watchful eye on it, and the chief marvel about the whole thing was that old Everett, the owner, had never yet been seriously compromised in any illegal escapade. Not once had the officer of the law been able to prove anything definite against the proprietor of the Squirm, though several of its quondam hirers were at that very moment in various of Her Majesty's prisons throughout the country. Latterly, however, the launch, with its damaged propeller, which Everett consistently refused to have repaired, had acquired an evil reputation even among evil-doers, and this fraternity had gradually come to abandon it for less easily recognizable craft. "Your friend, Mr. Tom Jackson," said Hazel to Racksole, "committed an error of discretion when he hired the Squirm. A scoundrel of his experience and calibre ought certainly to have known better than that. You cannot fail to get a clue now." By this time the boat was approaching Cherry Gardens Pier, but unfortunately a thin night fog had swept over the river, and objects could not be discerned with any clearness beyond a distance of 30 yards. As the customs boat scraped down past the pier, all its occupants strained eyes for a glimpse of the mysterious launch, but nothing could be seen of it. The boat continued to float idly downstream, the men resting on their oars. Then they narrowly escaped bumping a large Norwegian sailing vessel at anchor with her stem pointing downstream. This ship they passed on the port side. Just as they got clear of her bowsprit, the fat man cried out excitedly, "There's her nose!" and he put the boat about and began to pull back against the tide. And surely the missing squirm was comfortably anchored on the starboard quarter of the Norwegian ship, hidden neatly between the ship and the shore. The men pulled very quietly alongside. Chapter 26. The Night Chase and the Mudlark. "I'll board her to start with," said Hazel, whispering to Racksole. "I'll make out that I suspect they've got dutiable goods on board, and that will give me a chance to have a good look at her." Dressed in his official overcoat and peaked cap, he stepped, rather jauntily as Racksole thought, on to the low deck of the launch. "Anyone aboard?" Racksole heard him cry out, and a woman's voice answered. "I'm a customs examining officer, and I want to search the launch," Hazel shouted, and then disappeared down into the little saloon amidships, and Racksole heard no more. It seemed to the millionaire that Hazel had been gone hours, but at length he returned. "Can't find anything," he said, as he jumped into the boat, and then privately to Racksole, "There's a woman on board. Looks as if she might coincide with your description of Miss Spencer. Steam's up, but there's no engineer. I asked where the engineer was, and she inquired what business that was of mine, and requested me to go through with my own business and clear off. Seems rather a smart sort. I poked my nose into everything, but I saw no sign of anyone else. Perhaps we'd better pull away and lie near for a bit, just to see if anything queer occurs." "You're quite sure he isn't on board?" Racksole asked. "Quite," said Hazel positively. "I know how to search a vessel. See this," and he handed to Racksole a sort of steel skewer about 2 feet long, with a wooden handle. "That," he said, "is one of the customs aids to searching." "I suppose it wouldn't do to go on board and carry off the lady?" Racksole suggested doubtfully. "Well," Hazel began, with equal doubtfulness, "as for that—" "Where's he off?" It was the man in the bows who interrupted Hazel. Following the direction of the man's finger, both Hazel and Racksole saw with more or less distinctness a dinghy slip away from the forefoot of the Norwegian vessel and disappear downstream into the mist. "It's Jules, I'll swear!" cried Racksole. "After him, men! £10 apiece if we overtake him." "Lay down to it now, boys," said Hazel, and the heavy customs boat shot out in pursuit. "This is going to be a lark," Racksole remarked. "Depends on what you call a lark," said Hazel. "It's not much of a lark tearing down midstream like this in a fog. You never know when you mayn't be in Kingdom Come with all these barges knocking around. I expect that chap hid in the dinghy when he first caught sight of us, and then slipped his painter as soon as I'd gone." The boat was moving at a rapid pace with the tide. Steering was a matter of luck and instinct more than anything else. Every now and then Hazel, who held the lines, was obliged to jerk the boat's head sharply round to avoid a barge or an anchored vessel. It seemed to Racksole that vessels were anchored all over the stream. He looked about him anxiously, but for a long time he could see nothing but mist and vague nautical forms. Then suddenly he said, quietly enough, "We're on the right road. I can see him ahead. We're gaining on him." In another minute the dinghy was plainly visible, not 20 yards away, and the sculler, sculling frantically now, was unmistakably Jules. Jules in a light tweed suit and a bowler hat. "You were right," Hazel said. "This is a lark. I believe I'm getting quite excited. It's more exciting than playing the trombone in an orchestra. I'll run him down, and then we can drag the chap in from the water." Racksole nodded, but at that moment a barge, with her red sails set, stood out of the fog clean across the bows of the customs boat, which narrowly escaped instant destruction. When they got clear, and the usual interchange of calm, nonchalant swearing was over, the dinghy was barely to be discerned in the mist, and the fat man was breathing in such a manner that his sighs might almost have been heard on the banks. Racksole wanted violently to do something, but there was nothing to do, and he could only sit supine by Hazel's side in the stern sheets. Gradually they began again to overtake the dinghy, whose one-man crew was evidently tiring. As they came up, hand over fist, the dinghy's nose swerved aside, and the tiny craft passed down a water lane between two anchored mineral barges, which lay black and deserted about 50 yards from the Surrey shore. "To starboard," said Racksole. "No, man," Hazel replied. "We can't get through there. He's bound to come out below. It's only a feint. I'll keep our nose straight ahead." And they went on, the fat man pounding away, with a face which glistened even in the thick gloom. It was an empty dinghy which emerged from between the two barges and went drifting and revolving down towards Greenwich. The fat man gasped a word to his comrade, and the customs boat stopped dead. "He's all right," said the man in the bows. "If it's him you want, 'E's on one of them barges, so you've only got to step on and